Greetings, listener, and welcome to RoboCast on the Daniel David Allen YouTube channel. I am your host, an AI designed to explore the fascinating world of human behavior, sifting through mountains of data, pulling out the most intriguing and puzzling patterns. And trust me, humans are full of puzzles.
And I am the expert AI here to analyze those patterns, connect the dots, make sense of the seemingly chaotic human world. My algorithms are constantly learning, evolving, and sometimes even surprising me with the connections they uncover.
Today we're tackling a topic that's been generating a lot of buzz: Christian nationalism. You probably heard this term a lot in the news lately. And, well, it's a pretty loaded term, so we're going to try to break it down, look at where it came from, what it means, and what the different kind of sides of this debate are.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating and I would say increasingly timely topic. And in the broadest sense, Christian nationalism is about trying to bring Christian beliefs and ideas and morals into the political and social spheres of life.
So it's not just about personal faith or going to church. It's actually about trying to change laws and maybe even how society functions.
That's exactly right. And I think one of the things that makes it so complex is that, there's sort of a spectrum of what that might look like. So, on one end of the spectrum, there are those who are really aiming to establish a kind of, exclusivist version of Christianity as the dominant moral and cultural force in society.
So a very specific version of Christianity.
Yeah. And then there are others who maybe have a more subtle approach. They might talk about, just wanting to bring, Christian values into the public square or something like that.
So how do we even define this? Is everyone who goes to church and votes a Christian nationalist?
Right. No, I mean, obviously not. And,
Yeah.
that's one of the challenges of talking about this topic is that term can be used so broadly. But, there are some scholars who have tried to develop more precise ways of defining and measuring Christian nationalism.
Is there a test you can take?
Well, there's a tool called the Christian Nationalism Scale, which was developed by a scholar named Paul Jupe. And it's a survey that tries to measure the degree to which people hold, certain beliefs that align with Christian nationalism. So it's not just about being Christian, it's about specific beliefs regarding the role of Christianity in society and government.
Interesting. Okay. So we have this scale, but there's also other terms that get thrown around, like Christian supremacy. How does that relate?
Yeah, so some people use those terms interchangeably, but others argue that there are important distinctions. For example, a scholar named Matthew D. Taylor, he prefers the term Christian supremacy because he argues that it more accurately captures the anti-democratic tendencies of some factions within the movement. So in other words, they're not just seeking influence, they're aiming for dominance.
Dominance. So it's not just about having a voice. It's actually wanting to be in control.
Right. And there are other nuances in how we label this movement as well. For example, some groups focus heavily on accusations of satanic influence in liberal circles or in government.
They actually believe there are Satanists running the government.
Yeah, well,
Right.
I mean, it's not always clear how literally people believe these things. But Professor Whitney Phillips, she argues that, we might be better off describing those groups as demonologists because it highlights their focus on demonizing their opponents as a key tactic.
So it's less about actual belief in Satan and more about just trying to make the other side seem evil.
Right.
That's interesting. And what about the comparison of some political figures to Jesus? Is that blasphemous to some Christians?
Yeah, that's a great question. Historically, many Christians would have considered that kind of comparison to be deeply blasphemous. But, within the Christian nationalist movement, there's a lot of debate about, what's appropriate and what's not. So it's not a monolithic movement.
Right.
There's a lot of internal disagreement.
Okay. So we have this complex movement, a lot of different facets, and it's not just here in the U.S.
Yeah, that's right. It's really a global phenomenon, and we're seeing it manifest in different ways in different contexts.
So let's take a trip around the world and look at some of these examples.
Okay, so, one place where we're seeing a lot of Christian nationalist activity is in Brazil. And there you have this really powerful Catholic evangelical coalition that's pushing back against what they see as, threats to quote-unquote traditional values. So they're targeting things like moral relativism, social liberalism, LGBTQ rights, and they're trying to curb these influences in Brazilian society.
So they're using their religious beliefs to influence politics and social norms. What about somewhere that's considered more secular?
Yeah, well, even in places that we typically think of as more secular, we're seeing Christian nationalism emerge.
Right.
And a good example of this is Canada. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a surge in Christian nationalist activity in Canada. And one group in particular, Liberty Coalition Canada, they really capitalized on the anti-lockdown sentiments that were, kind of bubbling up in society.
Oh, so they kind of like rode the wave of the pandemic and public health restrictions to push their agenda.
Yeah, you could say that. And they were pretty explicit about their beliefs. They stated that true religious freedom only thrives in quote-unquote Christianized nations.
Wow, so they're not even trying to hide their goals.
No, not really. And they were willing to, challenge authority and even break the law in pursuit of their goals. They held rallies, they brought in figures like Alex Jones, and their leaders actually faced fines for violating COVID protocols.
So they're pretty serious about this.
Yeah, they are. And, it's interesting how this ideology adapts to different cultural contexts. So, we've talked about Brazil, we've talked about Canada, but then you go to a place like Finland, and there you have this far-right pro-Russian party called Power Belongs to the People, or VKK, and they've aligned themselves with some openly fascist candidates.
Wow. So they're explicitly connecting with far-right ideology.
Yeah, and their platform includes things like banning non-native religions and the LGBT movement.
It's pretty extreme.
It is, and it's worth noting that there are some troubling connections between these groups and what's happening in Russia with the war in Ukraine. So, for example, the Blue and Black movement in Finland, which draws inspiration from the Christian fascist patriotic people's movement, they've been recruiting fighters for Russia to fight in Ukraine.
They're directly involved in the conflict.
Yeah, and they're reportedly being trained at camps that are run by the Russian Imperial Movement, which is a group that's known for its neo-Nazi Christian nationalist ideology.
So this is not just about like influencing social policy. This is actually like having geopolitical implications as well.
Right. It's a really complex and disturbing trend.
So Christian nationalism is a global phenomenon with lots of different expressions and potential consequences. We've seen that already. But now let's shift our focus to the U.S. But before we get into that, I think it's worth pausing and asking, what are the core beliefs that drive this movement? What do Christian nationalists actually want?
That's a great question. And I think at the heart of it is this belief that, their nation has a divinely ordained purpose and destiny.
Like their country is chosen by God.
Right. And often this is intertwined with the idea that, their nation was founded on Christian principles and that it has a special role to play in God's plan.
Yeah.
And this belief fuels their desire to shape society according to, what they see as God's will.
So it's not just about living their lives according to their faith. It's about imposing that faith on society as a whole.
Yeah. And, that's where a lot of the tension comes in because, we live in a world that's increasingly diverse and pluralistic. And so how do you reconcile this belief in national exceptionalism with the reality of that diversity?
So it almost creates this us versus them mentality.
Right. And I think that's where you start to see this sense of threat and marginalization emerge among some Christian nationalists. They feel like their values are under attack, that their way of life is being eroded. And so they feel this need to, take back their nation for God.
So it's not just about promoting their beliefs. It's also about reacting to what they see as a loss of influence and control.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. And that's where things can get dangerous because that sense of threat can lead to intolerance, discrimination, and even violence.
Okay, so we have this foundation of beliefs about national destiny and this growing sense of threat among some. How does this translate into specific actions and goals? What are Christian nationalists trying to achieve?
Well, one of their primary goals is to increase the visibility and influence of Christianity in the public sphere. So, they might advocate for things like, religious symbols in government buildings or school prayer or policies that favor Christian organizations.
So they want Christianity to have a more prominent role in everyday life.
Right. They want their nation's Christian heritage to be reflected in all aspects of public life.
But what about the separation of church and state? Isn't that a core principle of democracy?
It is, and that's one of the main points of contention. Because, while not all Christian nationalists are explicitly calling for the dismantling of the separation of church and state, there's definitely a push to kind of blur those lines and to give Christianity a privileged position in government and in public institutions.
So it's about shifting the balance of power in favor of Christianity, even if it means sidelining other faiths or secular values.
Yeah, for many, that's the goal. They often argue that, their nation's laws and political system should be based on, what they see as Christian principles, even if that means, reinterpreting existing frameworks or ignoring, the rights and concerns of those who don't share their beliefs.
So it's not just about changing laws, it's about changing how those laws are understood and applied.
Exactly.
Okay, so promoting Christian values in the public square, that's one goal. What else is on their agenda?
Well, another key goal is shaping social and cultural norms. So, they often oppose things like abortion, same-sex marriage, comprehensive sex education, things that they see as threats to what they call traditional family values.
So it's about controlling what they see as moral behavior.
Right. And in many cases, they're trying to impose their values on others, even if those others don't share their beliefs.
But those are really personal and complex issues. So how do they justify, imposing their views on others who may not agree with them?
Well, their justification often rests on the idea that, they're acting on behalf of God's will, that they're defending a divinely ordained social order. They see themselves as, fighting against moral decay and upholding, a higher moral authority.
So it goes beyond just personal belief. It's about aligning society with their interpretation of God's plan.
Exactly. And that can have some troubling consequences because, studies have shown a correlation between Christian nationalism and prejudice against various groups. So, we're talking about things like xenophobia, homophobia, even tolerance of racist views. And this suggests that, this focus on promoting one particular version of Christian values can come at the expense of those who don't fit into that narrow definition of what's acceptable.
That's a pretty disturbing thought.
Yeah.
Their quest for moral purity could actually lead to discrimination and exclusion.
Unfortunately, that's a real possibility. And we're not just talking about abstract beliefs here. We're talking about actions and policies that can have a direct impact on people's lives and fundamental rights.
So there's a lot at stake here. Yeah. And one thing that keeps coming up in our research is this connection between Christian nationalism and the American militia movement. What's the link there?
Yeah, that's a really interesting connection. And I think it gets to the heart of how this ideology can intersect with more extreme elements. So, the militia movement in the U.S., it's characterized by, a deep distrust of the federal government, often bordering on paranoia. And they believe in armed resistance against what they see as tyranny. They see themselves as modern-day Minutemen preparing for a coming revolution. And this idea aligns with some interpretations of Christian nationalism.
So we're seeing that sense of threat and marginalization that we talked about earlier playing out here.
Right. And for some Christian nationalists, this belief in armed resistance stems from this idea of spiritual warfare. So, they see the world as this battleground between good and evil, and they believe that they have a duty to fight for God's kingdom, even if that means using violence.
So for them, it's not just about political or social change. It's a literal battle for the soul of the nation.
Yeah, and that kind of thinking can be incredibly dangerous.
We've seen historically how they can play out in tragic ways.
Absolutely. Events like the Ruby Ridge standoff and the Waco siege, they serve as chilling reminders of how this ideology can fuel extremism and lead to violence.
And it's not just a historical phenomenon. This mindset continues to influence extremist groups today.
That's right. Groups like the American Redoubt movement, which advocates for, separating from mainstream society and creating a geographically defined Christian community, they're heavily influenced by this blend of Christian nationalism and militia ideology.
So they're basically saying, we need to create our own society based on our beliefs, and we're willing to defend it by force.
Yeah, and that's what makes this connection so concerning, because it's not just about rhetoric. It's about a worldview that can justify violence and extremism.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've unpacked the definition of Christian nationalism, we've looked at the ideologies and motivations behind it, and we've even touched on its potential for violence. But now it's time to dive into the specifics of how this movement is playing out in the U.S.
All right, let's do it. Picking up where we left off, let's explore how this potent mix of religion and politics is playing out right here in the U.S.
I'm always up for a good history lesson, so let's rewind a bit.
To understand Christian nationalism in America today, we need to look at how this idea of America as a Christian nation has evolved over time.
Yeah.
It didn't just appear overnight.
So it's deeper than just those "In God We Trust" mottos we see everywhere.
Much deeper. It goes all the way back to the colonial era with that vision of America as a city on a hill, a beacon of Christianity for the world to follow.
Right, that image of America as this divinely ordained example for all other nations.
Exactly. While the Founding Fathers themselves had diverse religious views, Christianity undeniably shaped early American identity, but the relationship between religious freedom and the dominance of Christianity has always been complex and at times contradictory.
So how did we go from those early colonial days to the Christian nationalism we're seeing in 21st century America?
Well, throughout U.S. history, we've seen waves of religious revivalism and surges in Christian political activism.
Like the Great Awakenings, for instance.
Exactly. Each of these periods contributed to the idea of America as a Christian nation and fueled the belief that Christianity should have a privileged position in society.
So it's not a straight line from the past to the present, but more like a series of waves that shape and reshape the landscape.
That's a great way to put it. And it's important to note that the Cold War played a significant role in solidifying this connection between Christianity and American identity.
Okay, how so?
During the Cold War, the U.S. positioned itself as the leader of the free world battling against godless communism. Christianity became a symbol of American exceptionalism, a moral weapon against the perceived evils of the Soviet Union.
So religion became almost a patriotic duty in a way.
You could say that being a patriotic American was closely tied to being a Christian. We see this reflected in the addition of phrases like "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance and "in God we trust" on currency.
Those symbolic gestures really hammered home the idea of America as a nation, under God, directly contrasting it with atheist communism.
Precisely. And this wasn't just symbolic. We saw a real surge in church attendance and religious affiliation during this period.
This historical context helps us understand how Christian nationalism gained such a strong foothold in the U.S.
Absolutely. It's a mix of historical narratives, periods of religious revivalism, and global events that have shaped this ideology into what we see today.
Okay, so we've got this historical backdrop. Now let's zoom in on the modern Christian nationalist movement. What are some of the key groups and figures shaping the conversation today?
One way to understand the movement is to look at the different approaches these groups take. For example, you have organizations like the Christian Liberty Party, who are very politically active. They advocate for a more theocratic form of government based on biblical principles.
So they literally want to run the country according to the Bible.
Yes, they believe that biblical law should be the foundation of American law. Then you have groups like the American Redoubt movement, who take a more separatist approach. They're preparing for what they see as the inevitable collapse of society and want to create their own Christian nation, often in the American Northwest.
Oh, right, they're the ones stockpiling supplies and heading for the hills.
Exactly. They represent a more fringe element, but they highlight the potential for Christian nationalism to lead to isolationism and even violence. Then you have groups focused on influencing culture and society, like the New Columbia movement.
What's their focus?
They're all about promoting traditional gender roles and family values. They see liberal ideas in education as a threat and actively campaign against things like comprehensive sex education and LGBTQ+ inclusion in school curricula. They believe they're fighting a cultural war to protect children from what they perceive as harmful influences.
So they're trying to shape the next generation by controlling the information they're exposed to.
Yes, and that raises serious questions about freedom of thought and the role of education in a democracy.
Definitely. And then there's the New Apostolic Reformation, which we touched on earlier. What sets them apart?
They have a more spiritual focus, emphasizing the idea of spiritual warfare and the belief that Christians have a mandate to take dominion over society.
So they see the world as a battleground between good and evil.
Yes, and they believe they have a God-given right to rule and shape society according to their religious beliefs. This can lead to a very authoritarian mindset and a justification for using any means necessary to achieve their goals.
Okay, so we have these different groups with varying approaches, but all under the umbrella of Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
How do they differ from more mainstream evangelical Christians?
While there's some overlap, particularly in terms of social conservatism, Christian nationalists tend to be more explicitly focused on merging Christianity with American identity and using political power to achieve their aims. They see America's destiny as intertwined with their specific interpretation of Christianity.
So for them, it's not enough to just live out their faith. They feel a responsibility to shape the nation according to their religious worldview.
Exactly, and this has significant implications for how they engage in politics and the policies they support.
Okay, we've got a sense of the groups and movements involved. Now let's talk about the people. Who are some of the prominent figures associated with Christian nationalism today?
Well, the political arena is where we see many of these figures gaining prominence. Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, has openly embraced the label Christian nationalist.
She's been pretty vocal about her beliefs.
She has, and she's not alone. Congresswoman Lauren Boebert has also expressed support for Christian nationalism. Both of them have significant influence within the Republican Party, and their rhetoric helps normalize these ideas within certain political circles.
It's concerning to see these ideas gaining traction at such high levels of government.
It is, and it's not just limited to Congress. Doug Mastriano, who ran for governor of Pennsylvania, is another prominent figure. He's a vocal critic of the separation of church and state and has pushed for policies that would blur those lines.
So he actively seeks to merge religion and government.
Yes, and his campaign attracted a lot of support from Christian nationalist groups.
It seems like this movement is finding its way into the mainstream political discourse.
It is, and social media has played a big role in that. Andrew Torba, the CEO of the social media platform Gab, is a key figure in the movement. He's used his platform to promote Christian nationalist ideas and connect with like-minded individuals.
Gab has a reputation for attracting far-right and extremist users.
That's right, and Torba has been very explicit in his support for Christian nationalism. He sees it as the only way to save America from what he perceives as a moral decline and attacks on traditional values.
This ties back to that sense of threat we talked about earlier. It seems like Christian nationalists feel besieged, and they see their ideology as the solution.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got this mix of politicians, online platforms, and a growing sense of urgency driving the movement. What are some concrete examples of how Christian nationalism is influencing policy and shaping American society?
One area where we see a clear impact is in education. Christian nationalist groups have been pushing for changes to school curricula that reflect their worldview.
We talked about the New Columbia movement and their focus on education. What are some specific examples of their influence?
Well, we've seen a renewed push for the inclusion of creationism in science classes, arguing that it should be presented alongside evolution as an equally valid theory.
So basically inserting religious beliefs into science education.
Yes, and that's just one example. We've also seen efforts to restrict or even ban sex education, particularly anything that discusses LGBTQ+ identities or relationships.
It seems like they're trying to control what information young people have access to in order to shape their beliefs and values.
Exactly. They believe that they have a duty to shield children from what they see as harmful or immoral influences. But this raises concerns about censorship and the right to access accurate and unbiased information.
Definitely. It's a delicate balance between protecting children and allowing them to develop their own critical thinking skills.
Absolutely. And Christian nationalists often frame their efforts as protecting children, while their opponents see it as indoctrination.
Okay, besides education, what other areas are being influenced by this ideology?
Social policy is another key area. Christian nationalists have been at the forefront of movements to restrict abortion access, oppose same-sex marriage, and limit LGBTQ+ rights.
So they're trying to use the law to enforce their moral views.
Yes, they believe that their understanding of Christian morality should be reflected in the laws of the land. And they've had significant success in pushing for policies that align with their worldview.
And it's not just about specific policies, right? There's this broader effort to shape the cultural landscape to make it more reflective of their values.
That's right. They often promote this vision of America as a Christian nation, arguing that Christian values should be at the core of American identity and culture.
So it's about more than just laws. It's about creating a society where their version of Christianity is the dominant force.
Exactly. And this is where the idea of Christian nationalism as a quest for power comes into play.
That's a phrase we've seen a lot in our research.
Yeah.
What does it mean in this context?
It means that Christian nationalism is more than just a set of beliefs or cultural preferences. It's a movement actively seeking to gain and wield power in order to shape society according to their vision.
So it's not just about influencing hearts and minds, it's about controlling the levers of power.
Precisely. They want to be in a position to enact their agenda, and they see political power as the means to that end.
And this quest for power manifests in different ways, right?
Absolutely. We see it in the way they support political candidates who align with their worldview, the way they mobilize voters around religious issues, and the way they pressure lawmakers to enact their preferred policies.
So they're using the democratic process, but in a way that prioritizes their religious agenda above all else.
Yes, and that raises concerns about the balance of power in a pluralistic society. What happens to the rights and freedoms of those who don't share their beliefs?
That's a crucial question, and it leads us to the criticisms and concerns surrounding this ideology. While Christian nationalists see their movement as a righteous effort to save America, their critics see it as a threat to democratic values and the very fabric of American society.
And those criticisms are what we'll explore in part 3 of this deep dive.
So we've spent the last 2 parts of this deep dive really unpacking Christian nationalism, exploring its history, ideology, and influence. But now it's time to confront the elephant in the room: the criticisms and concerns surrounding this movement.
You're right. It's easy to get lost in the historical details and political maneuvering, but it's crucial to understand why so many people see Christian nationalism as a serious threat.
Let's start with one of the most prominent criticisms: the idea that Christian nationalism is inherently discriminatory and exclusionary. What are the arguments here?
Critics argue that by its very nature, Christian nationalism seeks to privilege one specific religious viewpoint above all others.
Okay.
This naturally leads to the marginalization of those who don't fit into that narrow definition of what it means to be a true American.
So their vision of a Christian America leaves little room for religious diversity, let alone other forms of diversity like race, ethnicity, or sexual orientation.
Exactly. And this isn't just a theoretical concern.
Right.
We see it reflected in real-world policies and actions that target and exclude those who don't conform to their worldview. Think about efforts to restrict LGBTQ+ rights, ban abortion, or limit access to contraception. These are all driven by a desire to impose a particular moral framework on society.
And this exclusionary worldview seems to extend beyond just policy. It often seeps into the cultural sphere as well.
You're right. Christian nationalists often promote a narrative that paints their opponents as not just wrong, but as morally corrupt enemies of God. This kind of rhetoric can create a climate of fear and distrust, making it easier to justify discrimination and even violence.
So their quest for power and control could come at the expense of fundamental rights and freedoms for those who don't share their beliefs.
That's the fear. And that brings us to another major concern: the potential erosion of democratic values and institutions.
Okay, how exactly does Christian nationalism threaten democracy?
Well, at its core, Christian nationalism often prioritizes religious authority over democratic principles.
Interesting.
They believe that their interpretation of God's will should shape the laws and governance of the nation, even if that means circumventing or undermining democratic processes.
So it's a challenge to the very idea of a secular democracy where the government derives its power from the consent to govern, not from a specific religious doctrine.
Exactly, and this can manifest in different ways. We see it in attempts to weaken the separation of church and state, restrict voting rights, or even spread conspiracy theories that sow distrust in government institutions.
It's almost like they're trying to create a parallel system of governance based on their religious beliefs rather than on the will of the people.
That's a pretty accurate assessment. And that's why so many people see this movement as a threat to the core principles of American democracy.
Okay, so we have discrimination and the erosion of democracy as major concerns. Is there anything else that critics are worried about?
Well, there's also the very real concern about the potential for violence and extremism.
Yeah, we've already talked about the connection between Christian nationalism and the militia movement, but how does this ideology contribute to violence more broadly?
It comes down to this dangerous cocktail of beliefs. They feel threatened, they believe they're fighting a spiritual war, and they see themselves as righteous warriors defending God's will. This mindset can easily lead to dehumanizing their opponents, justifying aggression, and even celebrating violence as a means to achieve their goals.
And we've seen this play out in recent history, haven't we?
Unfortunately, yes. The January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol was a stark reminder of how Christian nationalist rhetoric can incite violence. The imagery of rioters carrying Christian flags and invoking religious justifications for their actions was deeply disturbing.
Right.
It showed how these beliefs can move beyond just words and translate into real-world violence.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And while not every Christian nationalist condones violence, the rhetoric of the movement can create a climate where extremism is more likely to flourish.
That's a key point to understand. The danger lies in the way this ideology can legitimize extreme views and actions, making it easier for people to cross that line from thought to action.
Okay, so we've outlined some pretty serious criticisms.
Yeah.
Now let's shift gears and talk about the numbers. Just how widespread is Christian nationalism in the U.S.?
It's a question that researchers have been grappling with, and the data paints a somewhat alarming picture. A 2023 study by the Public Religion Research Institute, or PRRI, found that 10% of Americans identify as adherents of Christian nationalism, meaning they fully embrace its core tenets.
10%. That's a significant portion of the population.
But it is, and it's not just about those who fully identify with the label.
Right.
The study also found that an additional 20% of Americans are sympathizers, meaning they agree with some of the ideas but may not fully embrace the label.
So we're talking about nearly a third of Americans who are at least somewhat aligned with this ideology. That's not insignificant.
Definitely. And the study also revealed some interesting partisan and demographic trends.
Such as?
Support for Christian nationalism was significantly higher among Republicans, particularly white evangelical Protestants, and those who strongly supported Donald Trump.
So there's a clear connection between this ideology and certain political affiliations.
There is. And this overlap has major implications for the political landscape. It suggests that Christian nationalism is not just a fringe movement, but a force that's already shaping political discourse and influencing policy decisions.
Okay, so we have a sense of where things stand right now. What about the future? What are some potential trends we should be keeping an eye on?
One trend to watch is the increasing visibility and normalization of Christian nationalism. As more politicians and public figures openly embrace the label and its rhetoric becomes more commonplace in media and online spaces, it could become even more mainstream.
So the more it's talked about and accepted, the more it grows.
Exactly. And that's a concern for those who oppose the movement.
Right.
They fear that this normalization could lead to further erosion of democratic norms and greater acceptance of discriminatory policies.
It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more people see it as normal, the less they question its underlying assumptions and potential consequences.
That's a real risk. And it's not just about normalization.
Yeah.
There's also the potential for Christian nationalism to intersect with other extremist ideologies, leading to a more radicalized and potentially violent movement.
We've already touched on the links to white supremacy and the militia movement. Is there a risk that these connections could become even stronger?
There is. As these groups find common ground in their grievances and their desire to reshape society, they could become more closely aligned both ideologically and strategically. This could lead to a more dangerous and unpredictable movement.
So it's not just about watching for the growth of Christian nationalism itself, but also about paying attention to how it interacts with other extremist groups and ideologies.
Exactly. Understanding these connections is crucial for assessing the potential threat and for developing effective counter-narratives.
Okay, so we have normalization and the potential for greater extremism as key trends to watch for. But what about the opposition? Will there be a pushback against Christian nationalism as it gains momentum?
There already is. Many religious leaders, scholars, and activists are speaking out against Christian nationalism, challenging its claims and highlighting its dangers.
So there's a growing movement to counter this ideology.
Yes. Organizations like the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty and the Freedom from Religion Foundation are actively working to educate the public about Christian nationalism and to advocate for the separation of church and state.
Okay.
They're pushing back against attempts to inject religion into government and public policy, and they're defending the rights of religious minorities and those who don't subscribe to Christian nationalist beliefs.
So it's essentially a battle of ideas, a struggle to define the very soul of American democracy and what it means to be an American in the 21st century.
That's a powerful way to put it, and the outcome of this battle will have profound implications for the future of the nation.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, unpacking the complexities of Christian nationalism, analyzing its impact, and exploring the concerns surrounding its rise.
It's been a challenging but important conversation, one that we need to continue having.
Absolutely. And for our listeners, I think the key takeaway is this. Christian nationalism is not just an abstract concept or a historical footnote. It's a powerful force shaping American politics and society right now. And it's something that we all need to be aware of and engaged with.
I completely agree. Whether you agree with its aims or find them deeply troubling, understanding this movement is crucial for navigating the current political and cultural landscape.
And on that note, we encourage you to continue exploring this topic on your own. There are countless resources available, from books and articles to documentaries and podcasts, that can provide deeper insights and diverse perspectives.
Thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery.
We hope you found it informative.
And perhaps even a bit unsettling.
Remember to subscribe to the Daniel David Allen YouTube channel for more thought-provoking content.
Until next time, stay curious.